And I'm going to talk first of all about black elephants. And the real threat to NATO and its cohesion are black elephants, risks that are widely acknowledged and familiar, the elephant in the room, but ignored. And when the elephant can no longer be ignored, it is passed off as an unpredictable surprise, a black swan, by those who were slow to address it. And that strikes me as being not just NATO's challenge, but the NRG's challenge, that I've heard these conversations for many years, but now really is different. We could be in a situation by 2030, if we don't play this right, that NATO might be around in name, but it wouldn't exist in practice. We'd have a kind of Yankosphere organized around the Americans and a kind of Eurosphere. At the center of all this is, to my mind, the most special and important relationship of all, the US-German relationship. And it's weak. Berlin and Washington, irrespective of whether it's Trump or Biden, do not share an awful lot of commonality. Many of us in Europe hope that once Trump has gone, that there'll be an end to transactionalism. It won't go away. It's here to stay. The transatlantic relationship henceforth is transactional. The reason it's transactional is because the pressures that the rise of China and a host of other problems the Americans are facing, both domestic and foreign, are putting them under such pressure that they have no alternative but to demand far more of we Europeans. Far more. And the choice, therefore, for we Europeans is, are we willing to pay the price for America's continued engagement in our security and defense? Irrespective of whether it's MENA or Russia or whoever, are we willing as Europeans to pay that price? And indeed, do we actually understand what we mean by NATO's future? My sense of listening to much of this discussion is there's a profound division within the alliance over what NATO's future should actually look like. And until we've sorted that out, found a new center of gravity for this post-COVID-19 alliance, in which the tasks are going to grow exponentially, but the available funds are going to fall exponentially, which requires a radical solution, by the way, then I find much of the debate fairly moot. One only has to look at what that future battle space that NATO will have to operate in will look like to get some sense of what I mean. Let's take NATO 2030, the battle space in which NATO must prevail, because at the end of the day, NATO is a war-fighting alliance. It's there to defend and deter. If it's going to defend and deter credibly in 2030, it is indeed going to have to be able to fight a future war in which European forces are interoperable with American forces. That includes artificial intelligence, big data, nanotechnology, machine learning, all the things we've been talking about, in some kind of applied pressure, when the speed of war and the speed of defense are going to accelerate so quickly that, as I said in a speech to the Committee for Standardization at NATO HQ last week, if you take the acceleration in military technology over the last 70 years, the next 10 will see that compressed into a decade and more. We really are on the edge of a revolution in military technology. So if we are going to talk about a NATO strategic concept, and I think we should, because the old one's dead, there were times when a dead strategic concept didn't really matter post-Cold War, because as long as we were talking and there was no friction, it does matter now. The plan matters. So the first thing I would hope from this strategic concept is an end to nostalgia about the old NATO. Because unless there is a transformed NATO, not an adapted NATO, I can't see how we can avoid a retreat into coalitions of the willing, where a few allies with a few bits of advanced kit go off and do things on their own privately, quietly. They might call it Five Eyes Plus or something. They'll talk about NATO being important, but in reality, we'd all know that if a real emergency took place in Europe, it would be the Americans with a couple of allies going in first, and they may turn to NATO somewhere downstream, because NATO wasn't really modernized. It's a talk shop, and it's not really able to deal nimbly with the kind of threats that could be emerging. So for me, to conclude, the down payment on this future NATO is a European future force that is able to operate with the Americans at the highest level of the conflict spectrum, that is able to operate across air, sea, land, cyber, information and knowledge, which will define the future war battle space, is able to move across Europe very quickly to reinforce deterrence, but also of sufficient mass and complexity to support frontline states in the south in dealing with chaos on the other side of the Mediterranean. Why? Because let's assume the worst case, which is what NATO's for. The worst case would be a multi-scenario crisis engineered, in which starts in the Indo-Pacific, which sees engineered crises across MENA, and in which the Russo-Chinese partnership is instrumentalized, with Russia causing trouble on NATO's eastern flank. There'll be no single, simple, nicely wrapped scenario. It will be anything to make America's life difficult. For me, NATO's function is clear in this environment. For Europeans to be able to field a high-end first responder force that, if the Americans are forced to be busy elsewhere, can hold the European theatre in that event. And if we don't do it, if we don't step up to that challenge, for all the nice talk about the broad security agenda that NATO should adopt, that is the point at which NATO could fail. Are we Europeans up to the challenge? And one final comment on strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is a consequence of power, not simply words. The more power that is relevant to NATO's defense and deterrent mission that we Europeans generate, the more autonomous we will be. The less willing that we are to invest in that power, COVID-19 or not, and I recognize that the economic crash is coming ahead of us, then I'm afraid strategic autonomy is a dream, because we will simply be too weak to be autonomous. Our method, well, the most efficient and effective method would be a common European defense, but that ain't going to happen. What we Europeans need to do is transform NATO standards and NATO interoperability into a roadmap for a much tighter, more efficient and more advanced European force concept within the framework of the alliance. That is the down payment we Europeans must make on the future alliance. And if we don't, hasta la vista NATO.